Hi, and welcome back to our chemistry flipped classroom. And today we're continuing in Unit 8, and we're talking about intermolecular forces of attraction, which we'll frequently just shorten to intermolecular forces or even to IMFs. And IMFs, or intermolecular forces, are really those things that are responsible for states of matter, whether something is a solid, a liquid, or a gas. But they're also responsible for a lot of other characteristics of materials. As an example, this droplet of water that you see here, the thing that holds it in that droplet shape is those intermolecular forces. So our goals for today are to be able to predict the intermolecular forces that are present based on the structure of the compound and to explain those intermolecular forces. And then our second goal is for you to be able to relate the melting and boiling points of materials to the intermolecular forces that are present. So let's talk about what intermolecular forces are. These are the forces that attract molecules to other molecules. These are not the forces within a molecule. These are not bonds, okay? Bonds are intramolecular forces, meaning within. Intermolecular forces are between two separate molecules. So some of our intermolecular forces are hydrogen bonding, which even though it has bonding in the name, is still not a bond. It's just a type of intermolecular force. We have dipole-dipole attraction, and we have dipole-induced dipole attraction. And then we have what are called London dispersion forces, or sometimes just London forces. And again, despite the fact that they have dispersion in their name, they are attractive forces. So it's really important to distinguish between intermolecular forces, these attractive forces between two different molecules, from bonds, which are intramolecular forces within a molecule. So we're going to talk about the relative strengths of these attractive forces, and we're going to compare them to covalent bonds, because covalent bonds are strong. We can talk about the differences between covalent and ionic, and we will do that. But as compared to a bond, which takes on average 400 kilocalories of energy to break, that's a bond. That's an intramolecular force. That's a sharing of electrons. When we talk about intermolecular forces, they are all much weaker than covalent bonds or ionic bonds or metallic bonds. So intermolecular forces, the strongest of the intermolecular forces is hydrogen bonding. Again, a bond, not a bond, a intermolecular force. Okay, much weaker at 12 to 16 kilocalories of energy to break hydrogen bonding. The next strongest is dipole-dipole interactions, which are again significantly weaker, half a kilocalorie to 2 kilocalories of energy to break. And then finally, London dispersion forces, which generally speaking require less than 1 kilocalorie of energy to break. So we're comparing intermolecular forces to bonds. Covalent bonds are actually bonds, and they are significantly stronger than these intermolecular forces. So this is just here for comparison purposes. Now, there are specific times when we will see stronger London dispersion forces or stronger dipole-dipole interactions. But as a general rule, hydrogen bonding is the strongest intermolecular force, followed by dipole-dipole, followed by London dispersion forces. All right, let's talk about each of these types of intermolecular forces. And we'll start with the strongest, and that's hydrogen bonding. So hydrogen bonding, as its name implies, has to have hydrogen present. So hydrogen bonding results from the attraction between hydrogen and its more electronegative neighbors like oxygen and nitrogen. Remember, not a bond, despite its name, it's an attraction. But in order to hydrogen bond, the hydrogen that's being attracted to those neighbors has to be covalently bonded to oxygen or nitrogen or fluorine. So we have to think NOF, okay, so, or FON, however we want to think of it, oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine. So the hydrogen has to be covalently bonded to one of those. And then because that atom is so electronegative and it pulls the electrons in so tightly, and hydrogen is so little, and it becomes so positive that it's then attracted to an electronegative atom on a neighboring molecule. And it's that attraction between that nearly naked hydrogen and an electronegative atom on a nearby molecule, that is hydrogen bonding. So it's not the bond between the hydrogen and the nitrogen or oxygen or fluorine that is what we call the hydrogen bond. It's the attraction between hydrogen and an electronegative neighbor. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. This one is an incredibly important example in terms of biology and in terms of us just being here. So you guys probably remember from your biology classes that adenine always bonds with thymine and guanine always bonds with cytosine when it comes to DNA. And the reason that that happens is because the way that the DNA zips and unzips, the way that it is able to be relatively easily broken, but not so easily broken as to damage DNA in the replication process, is that the forces that hold the two sides together are hydrogen bonds. And adenine and thymine both have two locations where they can hydrogen bond with a pair. And guanine and cytosine both have three. And so hydrogen bonding is actually the mechanism by which DNA zips up and by which it unzips. And so it's that perfect balance of easy enough to break that it doesn't require excessive energy from the cell, but strong enough that it's not likely to be disrupted under ordinary cell functions. Another place where hydrogen bonding is incredibly important is in water. It accounts for a lot of the characteristics of water in terms of its ability to dissolve other things, its structure when it's frozen, its high specific heat. All of those things have to do with this hydrogen bonding between hydrogen on a water molecule and oxygen on a neighboring water molecule. So that's hydrogen bonding. Let's talk about polar molecules and dipole-dipole attraction. So just a quick reminder that a molecule that has a center of positive charge and a center of negative charge is a polar molecule. It has a dipole moment. And so when we have a polar molecule, it can be attracted to the oppositely charged region of a neighboring molecule. And so we have dipole-dipole attraction, which means that these two polar molecules are attracted to each other by their opposite partial charges. So that's dipole-dipole. Now we have dipole-induced dipole. So if we have a strong dipole like water, it can induce a temporary dipole in a neighboring molecule. So water is so very polar that when oxygen comes by, the water will actually pull the electrons in an oxygen molecule towards the positive end of the water molecule, and it will create a temporary dipole in that oxygen molecule. And this is really what's responsible for the solubility of oxygen in water, which is what all aquatic life depends on. So it's incredibly important. All right, and our last intermolecular force is London dispersion forces. These are the weakest of the intermolecular forces, and they're directly proportional to the number of electrons in the molecule. And when you have a completely non-polar molecule, these are the only forces of attraction that are present in those molecules. If you have large molecules, because they have lots of electrons, you can have pretty substantial dispersion forces, which would mean that they're going to have relatively high boiling points. And your small non-polar molecules have weak dispersion forces and exist almost exclusively as gases. So let's talk about what's happening in a London dispersion force. So a London dispersion force is also called a temporary instantaneous dipole. And what that means is that if you look at a krypton atom as an example, the electrons are going to be pretty evenly distributed, but every now and then the electrons will get unevenly distributed and you'll have more electrons on one side of your atom than you do on the other. And then you have a negative side and a positive side. We use the example of sheep in a field. Most of the time they're going to be pretty spread out, but every now and then they all wind up on the same side of the field. And so we would have an unequal distribution of the sheep. This is why London dispersion forces are stronger when we have more electrons, because you can have a stronger partial negative charge and it's more likely for them to get out of balance. The easy way, the shortcut to look at how many electrons an atom or a molecule has is to look at its mass, because the number of electrons is going to be roughly proportional to mass. And so a lot of the time we'll talk about higher mass having higher London dispersion forces. That's because it is a shortcut for a way for us to look at number of electrons. So as an example, if we look at hydrocarbons, okay, so these are made of carbon and hydrogen. They are perfectly symmetrical, so they're non-polar. So their only intermolecular forces are London dispersion forces. But you notice that the bigger the molecule gets, the higher its boiling point gets. And that means that it has stronger and stronger forces. So, and you'll notice that a lot of these have higher boiling points even than water. And water has hydrogen bonding. So when you have big enough London dispersion forces, they can be stronger than hydrogen bonding or dipole-dipole attractions. So why am I showing you boiling points when we're talking about intermolecular forces? So when we talk about intermolecular forces, whenever we change states of matter, if we go from solid to liquid or liquid to gas, we just talked about this with phase changes, the molecules have to move away from each other. In order to move away from each other, they have to break these intermolecular attractions. So this means that as that intermolecular force strength increases, boiling point and melting point are going to increase as well. So that ends our discussion of intermolecular forces. I look forward to hearing your questions, and I'll see you in class.